Hello and welcome to Topic 4. We're going to be exploring gender and the right to vote. So, what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first we're going to look at political rights and the importance that political rights play in a democratic society. Then we're going to be looking at where we locate voting rights in the Constitution. And then we're going to be looking at the competing reasons for why women should be granted the right to vote. So competing reasons in support of women's suffrage. And I just wanted to clarify there that when you see that word suffrage, it means the right to vote. And so that when you hear the word like universal adult suffrage, it doesn't mean that all the adults in a country are suffering. Suffrage just means the right to vote. Now, I did want to remind you to make sure to watch the two other videos I posted this week. There will be a quiz on all three of the videos, including this one. There's only one video lecture, but then there are two short videos that talk about the Seneca Falls Convention and also talks about the role that African American women played in the suffrage movement. So let's go ahead and get started. So as we know, the United States is a democracy, rule of the people. And when we think about the word democracy, what we really mean isn't that every person gets the right to rule, vote directly on public policies. The United States is a republic. It's a representative democracy. It's not a direct democracy. That being said, that democracies rest on this concept called it's the principle of popular sovereignty. And what that means is that in a democracy, political authority rests in the hands of the people. And so for a country to be truly democratic, you have to know what the will of the people is, and that when you figure out what the will of the people is, what the people want, that what the people want should be reflected in the public policies that the government passes. What the people want should be reflected in who's elected to office. What the people want should be reflected in the structure of our government, right? And so democracy rests on the principle of popular sovereignty. And so if we're really going to live in a democratic society, that political rights, such as the right to vote, the right to hold a political office, the right to serve on a jury, okay, there are other political rights, but here we're going to focus on the right to vote, that for a country to be truly democratic, political rights must be inclusive, right? That all adult citizens need to be included in those political rights. So all adults need to have the right to vote. All adults need to have the political right to hold an office, to run for office, to join a political party, etc. So if you have a country that is exclusive, where the political rights are exclusive, that is that certain segments of that citizenry are denied the right to vote, right, or excluded from those political rights, it's very difficult to call yourself a democracy. And as we know, and as we'll learn in this chapter, that the United States, really until 1964 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that there could be a pretty good argument made that the United States was not truly a democracy because many people were excluded from the right to vote. And so let's take a look at the role the Constitution plays in deciding who gets the right to vote. Now, as I mentioned before, the United States Constitution does not identify who has the right to vote. And let me clarify what I mean by that. That the Constitution was created in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, and it was ratified by the states in 1788. And so when you look, and the Constitution initially didn't have any amendments. It was just 7 articles, the first 7 articles. And as the video points out that you're going to be watching, that when the framers, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, when they were talking about should they define who should have the right to vote in the Constitution, they decided not to put it in the Constitution. In fact, they probably thought that only white men with certain standing in society should have the right to vote, but they didn't want to actually specify that because they didn't want to deal with this controversial subject. And so they punted, as they say in the video that you're going to watch, and they left the decision to the states. And so states were the ones who decided who had the right to vote. And so you're going to, in your textbook, when you're thinking about women's suffrage, you're going to see that some women, depending on what state you lived in, They got the right to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment because the decision about whether or not you had the right to vote was left to the states. And some states gave women the right to vote earlier than the passage of the 19th Amendment. But the Constitution itself does not give a person a right to vote. And even being a citizen did not mean that you had the right to vote, right? And if you don't believe me, remember that case you learned about last week, Minor versus Happersett. Remember, that was the case where Virginia Minor, she lived in Missouri. She went to go register to vote. The state of Missouri said she couldn't vote. And that basically she sued the state of Missouri. She said that the state of Missouri was violating her constitutional right for citizens to vote. And she made that argument stemming forth from the 14th Amendment, right? You remember this from last week. But you'll also remember that the Supreme Court ruled that while they said women were citizens, that citizenship in and of itself does not confer a right to vote, okay? So it's really left to us amending our Constitution to make sure that people have the right to vote. And so there are three major amendments to the United States Constitution that deal with voting rights. The 15th Amendment in 1870, ratified in 1870, says that voting rights cannot be denied on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Okay. And so as you're going to learn this week too, in the videos and in the textbook, the 15th Amendment gives Black men the right to vote. We also are going to learn that the suffragettes, in particular Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were not supportive of the 15th Amendment. They thought women should have the right to vote, particularly white, wealthier women, educated women should have the right to vote before Black men. And so the 19th Amendment is not added to the Constitution until 1920. It gives women the right to vote. And then the 26th Amendment, added in 1971, note that date, gives 18-year-olds the right to vote. Okay, so all adult citizens, adult being defined as 18. Notice that date, 1970, that took place during the Vietnam War, because some states said you had to be 21 to vote. And you had young men who were being drafted to fight in the Vietnam War who were under the age of 21. And they're like, I can't express, where's the will of the people there, right? If the people who are going to fight the war don't have the right to vote against this war, right? That's not a democracy, okay? So that just gives you sort of an overview of the amendments that relate to voting rights. Let's move on now to talk specifically about women's right to vote in the 19th Amendment. Okay, so here's the language of the 19th Amendment, since this is what we're going to be talking about. It was added to the Constitution. It was ratified in 1920, okay? So about 100 years ago. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment is really pretty straightforward. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And it goes on to say that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And that's just added there because Congress has enumerated powers. And you could say if you don't include that in an amendment, then it's basically saying that Congress can't actually put this amendment into force. And so that's why that language is always included. If you look at the other voting rights amendments and a lot of amendments, you'll see that additional language. So the struggle for women's suffrage was long and diverse. As you'll read in the textbook, it was, an over a 70-year-long struggle. It was a mass movement, and it took a long time for women to get the right to vote. And many people think that it sort of mark the beginning of the women's suffrage movement at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And the Seneca Falls Convention is the first women's rights convention in the United States, and it launches the women's suffrage movement. And they presented this document called the Declaration of Sentiments, and that it was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. So on the next slide, which is like the worst slide ever because it has tiny print on it, but I wanted to sort of read some of the parts of the Declaration of Sentiments. So particularly of those of you who are familiar with the Declaration of Independence, you can see how closely the Declaration of Sentiments was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. So just as a refresher for y'all, that there's two major documents that are important to the founding of the United States. One is called the Declaration of Independence. The other is the United States Constitution. And the Declaration of Independence was written and signed in 1776. And it is basically a document that explains why we are becoming an independent nation and why we are breaking ties with Britain, with King George III. And so the Declaration of Independence is neat because it, one, identifies what are our values as Americans that are going to undergird, are going to provide a foundation for American political culture. But then it's just a document of complaints. It's basically saying this is why we have the justification from breaking from the King of Britain. So why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because the Declaration of Sentiments is sort of a very similar document, but rather than sort of making a case against the King of Britain, that the women who attended the Seneca Falls Convention were making a case for why they should break from patriarchy, right? That they're making a case for why that we need to change gender relations in the United States because it's harming women. And so, if for those of you who are familiar with the Declaration of Independence, I mean, this language is taken straight from the Declaration of Independence. It says the history, or almost straight, it says the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman. That's added. Having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world, okay? And so in the original declaration, they're sort of like, that the King of Great Britain is a tyrant and let us present facts. Well, that here they're saying that men are, act as a tyranny over women, tyrants over women, and we're going to present some facts to support that claim. You can also see there the most famous line probably from the Declaration that it says, of Independence is we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And so they added that language in the Declaration of Sentiments. But here are just some of the facts that are being submitted to a candid world about how men are tyrants, acting as tyrants over, or dictators over women. So he has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elected franchise. So it's never given her the right to vote. He's compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. Again, you call that a democracy? He has withheld from her rights from which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. Wait a second. We're going to see that some of the suffragettes were sort of flawed. And he has made her, if married in the eyes of the law, civilly dead. We'll talk about that later in the semester. And he's taken from her all rights and property, even to the wages that she earns. And actually, those are true statements. Those are things that took place throughout the course, most of the 19th century. So I just wanted to read that because it is an innovative way for the women and the men who attended Seneca Falls Convention to let their voice be heard in this sort of, piggybacking on the shoulders of one of the most radical documents in United States history. So the demands for women's right to vote, starting at the Seneca Falls Convention, are from the get-go rooted in the founding principles and the political creed that is so important to the United States. And, things such as that you have these natural rights, that anybody who is human, like in the Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so basically saying that if you are human, you get these rights. And newsflash, women are human, right? African Americans are human, right? Native Americans are human, right? And so, I teach American government and we talk about, can you even celebrate the founders knowing that the folks who wrote those words owned slaves? And, one of the retorts to that is once you put these words on the page, you can't take them back. And so when you say that men or humans are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that when people in a nation are denied those unalienable rights, they stand up, they say it's wrong, And oftentimes it gives them the political heft and weight that they need to change the minds of people that live in our democratic society. The suffrage movement, the abolition movement, all of those, civil rights movement, gay rights movement, all of those are examples of you take those words that are in our founding documents and you run with them and you win with them. And also that so the women's suffrage movement is rooted in these founding principles and creed. Also, that women were politically active at this time, not just in the women's the right to vote, but women, as you're going to see in the videos, were really involved in the abolition movement. In other words, the movement to end slavery in the United States. And in fact, as the videos will show, that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, these are people who are fighting against slavery, were a part of the abolition movement. And in fact, they women put aside their demands for suffrage, the right to vote, in order to end slavery. And so women, used their were politically involved and used their political skill to fight against slavery, to fight against alcohol. We'll talk about that on the next slide, and to fight for the women's the women's right to vote. Now, just keep in mind that the women fighting for and against suffrage were a complex, heterogeneous, and flawed group of people. Okay, as are all of our founders, all of our framers, all of the sort of mythical characters that we learn about in history class. These were, this is a diverse group of people. They were complex individuals, African-American women, African-American men, Frederick Douglass in particular, fought for the right to vote just as they fought against slavery. And that they made mistakes. As you'll see in the video, Frederick Douglass said that African-American men should get the right to vote before women. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton said absolutely not, that, educated white women should get the right to vote before slaves or those who have been born from slaves. And so just keep that in mind, that these are humans with human flaws, but that doesn't mean that they didn't achieve great political acts. Before I get started, I just want to make a correction from the last slide, that I had stated that Ida B. Wells was an abolitionist, and that is not correct. She was born into slavery in 1862, but by the time she became an adult political activist, slavery had ended. So she was active in the suffragette movement, and she was active in the early civil rights movement in the 1880s during Reconstruction, but she was not an abolitionist because by the time she became an adult, slavery had already ended. All right, so let's just say what are we going to be talking about on these as we move forward here. So as it says there, women in the right to vote, that there were differing goals that women had and men had, activists had, in terms of supporting the women's right to vote. And so the first reason we're going to look at is that that some folks supported the women's right to vote because they felt that it was the first step towards total political equality. And so the thinking is that if you don't have the right to vote, you can't be truly equal. That when you're denied the right to vote, you sort of are treated like a second-class citizen. And so that if you really wanted to be seen as a political equal to others, then you've got to start with giving women the right to vote. And that when you have the right to vote, then women will be able to lead to a greater level of participation, not just in terms of voting, but by getting more involved in politics and running for political office and winning political office and getting involved in government. And so from this perspective, that the vote is a pathway that leads to greater political and social equality. And they also argued that women are just like men when it comes to political perspective. that women are not a monolithic group. They don't all believe the same things. They're not going to all vote for the same political party or the same political candidate. They said that women are equal to men. Men are diverse in their perspectives, and women are diverse in their perspectives. And so you don't have to worry about giving the women the right to vote because you're going to vote just like according to women's issues. No, just like men, women are diverse and they hold a diverse array of perspectives. So they say that men don't vote as a block, all with some common concern, and women aren't going to do that either. And they also, say that that when you have political equality in a society, then that can lead to social equality too. Because that if you are given the right to vote and you get politically active and that you are demonstrating that that you as a woman are just like any other citizen in the United States, then other aspects, other differences based on stereotype begin to wither as well. So they saw that as a first step towards political equality, but also as an impact on social equality as well, as women gain these rights. Folks who were in this group of saying that they supported women's voting rights because it was first step to equality were what is known as the equity feminists, right? Sort of the what we now call sort of liberal feminists. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are both really good examples of suffragists who supported the right to vote because they saw it as the first step to broader equality for women. The other goal that women had for supporting the right to vote was the second reason here, which is that women would create a voting bloc. And so what a voting bloc is it's a group of people who are motivated by a common concern. Okay. And so like in the last slide, the equity feminists were saying women aren't going to all vote the same. This viewpoint saying, no, women are going to vote the same, right? So when you give women the right to vote, they're going to vote like they're going to bring the women's perspective to our government and politics. And so from their perspective, they saw voting rights not as a path. They saw it more as a path to influence politics, not as a path to full political equality. For them, they said, give the women the right to vote and they'll improve society. And they'll improve society because women are different and that they see the world differently. And in fact, that they just have some like biological differences that are beneficial and should be included in the political arena. They argue that women are more compassionate, they're more nurturing, they're child-centered, they understand suffering and they see suffering and they want to do something about it. They see women as seeing that society doesn't address the needs of those who are in dire straits, the poor. And so they say that women, will bring about social reforms if you give them the right to vote, and that they're not interested in running for office, but they'll elect men that will implement these reforms that will address suffering within our society. And so they basically called it the women's special vote. That if you give women the right to vote, they will bring this special quality to politics. Policy will change because it will reflect these special concerns, and that those special concerns are really good because they're going to improve our society. This perspective dovetails into popular political movements at the time. One at the end of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, there was a progressive movement in the United States, and the progressive movement was all about seeing corruption and wanting to reform corruption, get rid of it, improve things, clean up politics. And so this dovetails nicely into this because it's basically saying that politics as it is not really addressing the concerns of those who are the least among us, right, the weakest, and we need to alleviate that kind of suffering. It also fits into a political women movement known as the temperance movement, as is hallmarked by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And these were women who fought against alcohol. They supported prohibition, getting rid of alcohol. And they basically said that alcohol was evil and it damaged women's and families. So guys would be out working, they'd stop at the bar afterwards, they'd drink a bunch of whiskey, they'd come home and they'd beat their family, they'd beat their wife, they'd beat their children. And women in the temperance movement said, no, that's got to change. We've got to get this evil alcohol out because women and children are suffering. So this women's special vote dovetails really really nicely with that perspective. Examples are the social feminists that you read about in earlier chapters. And Jane Addams, I grew up in the Chicago area, and we would always take a trip to the Hull House, which was a house that was dedicated to alleviating poverty within some of the poorer areas of Chicago. And Jane Addams, a social worker, a progressive, is a really good example of this kind of woman, feminist who is fighting for the women's right to vote because they wanted women to bring the special women's voting bloc into politics. So, given the time period, which of these two reasons do you think would be most persuasive politically? So, if you wanted to give women the right to vote, which of these two reasons do you think would, that we just talked about, would be the most politically persuasive? Do you think that arguing that voting rights, giving women the right to vote, is a path for full equality for women would be more persuasive, get more people supporting women's suffrage? Or do you think that that we should support women's voting rights so that they can bring this special nature into the political arena, therefore reforming and improving our society? Which do you think would be more politically persuasive and therefore more politically effective? Just something to think about. Well, it won't come as a surprise to you that not everybody was on board with supporting the 19th Amendment and granting women the right to vote. So as it says there, don't forget about the antis, or those who were anti-women's suffrage. And there was a small minority of people in the United States, maybe less than a minority, but pretty, or less than completely small, and they were pretty vocal. And so there was, pushback to granting women the right to vote. And there were some postcards that were made at this time period that were arguing, making a case that would be distributed. They would distribute these postcards making a case for why women shouldn't get the right to vote, because and you can sort of see what the arguments are in these cards. If you take a look, and let me put on my special pen here, if you take a look at here, right, this is sort of like, hey, if you give women the right to vote, before you know it, they're going to become cops, right? I mean, so that's a woman that is dressed up like a police officer. But then, you sort of look at, instead of having her police baton, she has a rolling pin, right? And she has a fancy dress on. So it's sort of making this argument like, oh, if you give women the right to vote, before you know it, they're going to have these positions of power in our society. And those positions of power are going to be some sort of hideous amalgam, of a woman cop that uses a rolling pin. So, that was sort of a perspective there. I love this one, not love it, but I think, it does a good job of sort of illustrating some of the concerns. And this one too, it's sort of like, hey, if mom is out there getting full political equality, running for office, voting, supporting candidates, then who's going to be left to take care of the kids? Oh, look, it's this guy, he has to take care of kids, and it says suffragette Madonna, oh, a guy having to feed the baby, right? And this was seen as an abomination, right? Challenging men's masculinity, if you let women get politically equal, then before you know it, guys are going to have to take care of the kids. So you'll be reading about the antis in some of the articles that you're going to be reading this week, and I just thought I wanted to share these postcards with you because I thought they were super cool. Okay, so as we know, the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress and ratified by the states and added to the U.S. Constitution in 1920. So what was the impact of the 19th Amendment? And you're going to be reading an article about this week as well. Oh, well, one, impact is it upended the masculine conception of politics, that when women get the right to vote, then that women have the capacity to vote, right, and the ability to vote, and they do a good job. In fact, voter turnout rates, more women vote than men, right, in the United States. We'll be learning about that next class period. And then it upends the perspective that politics is a guy's thing, right? We still have a long way to go with that. We've never had a female president, right? A woman president. But this is the first step to challenging some of those stereotypes that government and politics is for men and men only. That now women had, because they had the right to vote, their connection to the political system was more direct. It was no longer indirect. So women had been involved in politics for a long time, but because they couldn't have the right to vote, they didn't have a direct connection. They couldn't let they couldn't directly impact politics by voting for people that they wanted to serve them, to represent them in the body, in our legislatures. And so this gives women a lot more political power, because they don't just have to, have marches and raise awareness but never get to the ballot box. The vote gives women this direct access. And then finally, it sparked that the 19th Amendment sparked attentions to issues associated with suffrage, so that there was this women's voting bloc to a certain degree. That as women got to vote and then they got to elect people, that they brought the issues that were concerns for them, temperance. We amended our Constitution to get rid of alcohol, to prohibit alcohol, and the progressive movement was supported by the concerns of women as well. So that the 19th Amendment sparks issues that are associated with suffrage, and it just makes America more democratic, small d, right? We're more of have embraced democratic principles. And as we started this lecture, we talked about how democracy is about political inclusion, not exclusion. And the more people that get the right to vote, the closer we come to forming a more perfect union. All right, that's it for me this week. And thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.